you so much. Are we ready to go? You want to put up the first picture? This is a picture of the New Orleans War. I just can't count the number of steamboats that are in that photograph. But all of them either passed down the falls and stopped here in Louisville, or they were built here. Because every boat on the Mississippi River system came from this area and went south. The history of Steamboat is so very large, I decided to try to combine my information and just focus on certain things. The Mississippi River system is 8,000 miles long. It goes from the upper New York area to Montana. The steamboats have been around for over 200 years. And my steamboat database has 12,000 files, over 12,000 files of steamboats that ran on the Mississippi River system. So I thought I'd shorten everything and just talk about steamboats in this area from the beginning. We all know that the American products that were in great demand for Europe were flour, cotton, tobacco, and bourbon. I don't know which order, so don't quote me on that, but those were the products that were needed in Europe. Once the colonies expanded over the west, they expanded west over the mountains, the Mississippi River became the western line of America. Then we went into ships. Where are you? Okay. The Tarascon brothers, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, were merchants in Philadelphia. They expanded their business to the Pittsburgh area, what we know now as the Pittsburgh area. They realized they could take their crops down the Ohio and the Mississippi River to New Orleans and around to Philadelphia faster and cheaper than they could take them back over the mountains. So at that time, they decided they were going to have to expand to this area. While there were flatboats and other river craft available at that time, the first ships to reach the fall was about 1797, which was actually before Kentucky was a state. By 1905, there had been 4 ships, 7 brigs, and 3 schooners that we know that had arrived at the falls. The Tarascon schooner was torn to pieces on the falls and did not make it any further. Their ship, the Pittsburgh, sank on the falls, but was able to pass over in 1802 on down to New Orleans. There was also a ship built on the Kentucky River in 1805, which did make it over the falls and went to New Orleans. The major problem with the ships was the rounded bottom that the ships needed once they reached the ocean, and the lack of wind on the Mississippi River system, the inland river system, and the lack of water in the upper Ohio. So the biggest problem of all was the falls of the Ohio. This meant this was the basis movement for the steamboats at that point, because steamboats would be flat bottom. They would have their own propulsion. Sorry. There were three main inventors who worked on the development of the steamboats. The first was John Fitch, who worked on a model of steamboats in 1787 on the Delaware River. He then moved to Nelson County, Kentucky in 1798. So he moved to this area also. James Rumsey was a mechanical engineer. And in 1787, he was on the Potomac River and worked with George Washington. I have found a couple of references, but I haven't verified it. But I think he actually moved here to Kentucky and lived with his son for a while, after his later years in life. He was not able to ever build a full-size steamboat. He only designed them and built models, which were a smaller design. At the time of his death, his papers went to his son, Dr. Edward Rumsey of Lexington. He brought his plans to the falls and talked with the Garretson shipyard in Silver Creek and actually built a steamboat at that time in 1819 that was named the Rumsey, and it was on the Rumsey plan. So that was the only steamboat actually built on a Rumsey plan. And of course, the most famous of all was Robert Fulton. He created the Orleans or the New Orleans, whichever you prefer, and Nicholas Roosevelt took the helm for the first successful trip down the river, the Ohio and Mississippi River from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. One thing that is not very well known about this trip is that they bypassed, on their trip down, they bypassed Cincinnati and landed at the mouth of the Beargrass Creek late one evening in December of 1811. This was done because Roosevelt's wife was getting ready to give birth to her second child. And she had already been here 2 years before and had met a midwife that lived in Shippingport. And she wanted that lady to deliver her baby. So we don't know if the baby was born on the New Orleans itself, or in Louisville, a hotel, or in Shippingport, one or the other, but he was born here somewhere. So she had to stay here for a little bit of recovery while they were waiting for water to go over the falls. And at that time, Nicholas Roosevelt offered trips to anyone who came down for a little bit of money. They got to ride up to maybe one of the islands and back. So the first steamboat excursions on the Inland River system actually started here at our wharf in Louisville. Now, the fourth person, which is not always well known, is Henry Shreve. He was so encouraged by Fitch's New Orleans and the success they had on the trip. So in 1813, Shreve built the Enterprise along with Daniel French, and this was in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. Shreve then served as a pilot on the Enterprise in 1814 with General Andrew Jackson for the Battle of New Orleans. They took actual people and shipping things that they needed down on that steamboat then. The Enterprise then came back up to the falls and arrived at Shippingport in 25 days. This is the first time a steamboat had ever come upstream. So that was another big feat, that they now knew that they could come all the way back up to Shippingport. The citizens of Louisville gave Captain Shreve a big public dinner for his accomplishments. The Enterprise proceeded to Pittsburgh and back several times, but then finally hit the rocks on Rock Harbor in Shippingport. So, and was destroyed there. That's what happened to that boat, that short life that we were talking about earlier, where they only lived a few years. In 1816, Shreve built the steamboat Washington at Wheeling, Virginia, and piloted the Washington from Pittsburgh to New Orleans and then back to Louisville in 1816 and 1817. At that time then, Shreve made Portland his home, and he stayed here. He also owned the Portland and New Albany ferry at that time, along with the warehouse that was on the Portland Wharf for many years. He's still remembered here at the falls because the Corps of Engineers named their largest inland river crane after him. And when it's not traveling, it is stationed at Shippingport Island today. It's not over there today specifically, but this time in history. In 1818, Shreve built the Ohio, Steamboat Ohio, in New Albany, and the Napoleon he built in Shippingport. These were both done for New Orleans trades. They both went south and never came back. In 1819, he built the Post Boy at New Orleans, and it carried mail from Louisville to New Orleans. And this was done under an act of Congress that was passed in March of 1819. And it was the first attempt at traveling mail on steamboats in the western United States. Her pilot was Captain John DeCarp. I'm telling you these names because they come up again and again. There were about 40 steamboats built before 1820 on the inland rivers. They all headed for New Orleans, so they all passed or stopped in Louisville at the falls at one time or another. I'm going to tell you about a few of the boats. I can't go through all of them. The second boat was the Comet that was built in Pittsburgh, and it was built by Daniel French, who was also working with Henry Shreve at that time. It reached Louisville the summer of 1817. And then in the spring of 1814, it had to wait to 1814, the spring of 1814, before it could go down to Natchez. Daniel French and his two sons then returned to Louisville, and they made this their home and stayed here for the rest of their life and built several steamboats. The third steamboat was the Vesuvius. It was built in 1814 in Pittsburgh by Robert Fulton, and its captain was John DeHart, who I mentioned earlier. While Captain DeHart and his brother Robson DeHart were both from the New York area, they worked for Fulton for several years, and then they returned to Louisville to build the volcano, Steamboat Volcano, at New Orleans in 1818. And John remained here in Louisville, and Robson lived in New Orleans. Other steamboats built in the area that in 1818. The Pike was built in Henderson, Kentucky. The Kentucky was built in Frankfort. The Governor Shelby and the Exchange were both built at Louisville, and the St. Louis was built on shipping ports. So there were several boats being built at that same time, that same year. At this point, steamboats were usually built for people who lived in New Orleans. They paid for them. So the ships, the boats at that point went south and never returned to this area. That's why they're not very well known here. If you read the New Orleans newspaper, you'll find out all that they did. Most of these boats were making regular trips on the Mississippi River, the lower Mississippi River, I should say. The General Clark was built in 1819 on Silver Creek. This boat was built by Washington and Jacob Garretson that I mentioned earlier, who were shipbuilders from Cape May, New Jersey. They built 6 of the 12 steamboats that were built in the New Albany area between 1825 and 1830. They also built several ships that ran from New Orleans to Havana and New Orleans to Philadelphia. So they were building ships in Silver Creek, right here in Louisville, and they were all going either, they went south and then they went up the East Coast, or they even went to Europe. The United States was the first boat built in Jeffersonville in 1819. It was built by Samuel Hart from New Orleans, and had 2 separate engines that were delivered from England. They actually ordered them and came in from England. She had the capacity of holding 3,000 bales of cotton, and she was the largest inland river steamboat built to that time. She weighed 700 tons. The Independence was built in Pittsburgh for the Yellowstone expedition, and that was the first steamboat to ascend the Missouri River. And so that had to pass here for a while anyway. Okay, next slide. Next slide.
This is the next slide.
Okay, we need to go to Lafayette.
Oh, okay.
No. Okay, next slide. I have to tell you. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry. Okay, in 1825, the biggest event in 1825 was the visit from Lafayette, who was touring America at the time. In May of 1885, the Lafayette departed Shantytown, Illinois, aboard the steamer Mechanic, and headed for Louisville. That night, the boat struck an obstacle in the Ohio River and began to sink. So Lafayette and all the passengers had to, they made it safely to shore and spent the night there on the shore. The next morning, the cargo steamer, Paragon, was heading downstream to New Orleans and came into view. One of the stranded passengers on the Mechanic was William Nelson of Louisville, and he was also the owner of the Paragon. So he ordered them to turn around and take Lafayette and his party back to Louisville. So on the morning of May the 11th, Lafayette arrived at the Portland Wharf instead of the planned Louisville Wharf. It was raining, but he was met with enthusiasm. They word sides were printed and distributed to all the citizens of Louisville so they would know how to get to the Portland Wharf. There apparently were thousands of people that appeared for the welcoming speech that was at Portland, and then he entered a carriage and then was escorted to Louisville for more festivities. On Thursday, Lafayette traveled across the river on the General Pike to Jeffersonville, and then on Friday morning they left Louisville for Frankfort in a carriage. There is a group that are getting together for all the Lafayette stops in the United States, and I think they are going to try to stop in the Louisville or Jeffersonville area for that. But to me, they should be coming to the Portland Market. Okay, in 1832, we had another very famous person. He was the Prince Maximilian of Weird, and with him, he brought his artist, Carl Bodmer. Next picture, please. Okay, this is Maximilian brought his artist so that, because there weren't photographs, so he could sketch all of the different things that they would see. And this is actually an 1832 sketch in watercolor of the boats at the Portland Wharf. They had arrived in Louisville, and the next afternoon they went to Portland, and there were 11 steamboats at the Portland Wharf that day. Since they had to take on some extra cargo, or another thing before that, when they arrived, they could not get to the boat. They had to actually put the carriage in the water to drive it, the carriage to the boat for them to get on. But then they had to stay on the boat, which was the water witch, until the cargo was all put on. So that gave Carl Brenner the time and the opportunity to make the sketches of the Portland Wharf. Okay, next slide. The blacks had a very strong history in steamboating, and there's so much I could say, but I don't have the time. As early as 1818, flatboats were loaded with slaves on their way down the Mississippi River to the southern markets of Natchez and New Orleans. The blacks did have a lot of roles of employment on steamboats: the firemen, the laborers, the cooks, the waiters, the housekeepers, and even the musicians. In 1856, a Louisville merchant, John Rudd, leased out his slaves to the owners of the steamboats, and this became a common practice. They were still owned by the one person, but they were working on the steamboats. A lot of the blacks liked this because it gave them a chance to travel, but they knew they were coming back to their own homes too. As early as 1820, there was an American Colonization Society established, and the ships would leave out of New Orleans and take the people of color to the settlement in Africa. This is a practice that went on for several years, and in 1831, Louisville and Cincinnati gathered 130 slaves that went south for that trip. The passage was from Louisville to Africa was $37. In 1851, Mr. Jacob Hikes freed 8 slaves from one family and paid their way to Africa for them. So the owners were actually paying their way so they could go back to Africa. Okay, next slide. This is one of the false pilots. Everybody knows about false pilots. This was Pinckney Varvel. Couldn't give pictures, I don't have pictures of all of them. The earliest false, there were over 60 false pilots that I know of, and I'm sure there might have been more than that. James Patton and his son-in-law, John Nelson, received the first false pilot's license as early as 1797. They were specially licensed. And this time they were taking flatboats and keelboats over the falls, no steamboats. Aaron Bowman was the first false pilot in Indiana, on the Indiana side in 1802. They were assigned by the governor and had a different license. 2 different states, they had 2 different license type things that were going on to be false pilots. By the 1840s, Enoch Lockhart and Pinckney Varvel were recognized as the most experienced rivermen in Louisville. Enoch then became superintendent of the reconstruction of the Louisville and Portland Canal in the 1850s. Pinckney Varvel was licensed to well into the 1860s, and after each of them stopped being false pilots, they would still take boats over the falls as a special request. Next slide. Okay, in March of 1855, Samuel Clemens was in Cincinnati when he wanted to head home. He boarded the Paul Jones and headed for Louisville. When they arrived at the canal, it was full of mud, and there was very little water on the falls. So they ended up having to stay in Louisville for 2 days. Finally, they hired a falls pilot that took them over the falls. And Samuel Clemens talked his way up to the pilot house and was allowed to stay on the boat when they went over the falls. They pulled into Portland, the Portland Wharf, and the passengers and the cargo was loaded at that time. It was then that the Paul Jones got stuck on the famous Portland bar. Yes, Portland is famous for a bar on every corner, but this was a different kind of bar. Samuel Clemens witnessed something that day that he had never heard before, and it was the calling of the lead line. There would be what they call a leadman that would drop a line with lead as an anchor to measure the depth of the water as they were trying to back out. This was the first time Samuel Clemens had heard the term Mark Twain, which measured the water as being a safe measurement of 12 feet. Mark Twain had thought this sounded right, and of course we all know that he adopted that name for himself. Didn't know if anybody, that was something very few people know. That was in the 50s, 1855, I believe. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going into the Civil War a little bit. A lot of people down south called it the Lincoln's War. They did not call it a Civil War. It was very devastating for the entire steamboat industry, but didn't kill the industry. You need to make that quite clear. Being in the South, steamboats in the South came to a complete standstill. The Confederates were attacking all boats. They did not know if they were aligned with the South or the North. They could come north, they could not come north for repairs, and the steamboat building at the falls stopped, and many of the shipyards closed at that time. Coal could not go south. The boats were burning wood. The value of Southern money was also a problem. And for the plantation owners to get information, it was all done by the newspapers that the steamboats brought. So by the steamboats not running, they didn't get newspapers. They had no communication, the plantations at that time. Many rivermen who were working out of New Orleans were actually from the Falls area. So there was a big conflict of whether they were for the North or for the South. And a lot of them got in trouble, one way or the other. They were afraid then to go south if they were here, afraid of being killed, and also being afraid of their boats being destroyed. A lot of steamboats were destroyed in the South because of that. But the Union Army needed steamboats to go south to deliver men and supplies. But under the Steamboat Inspection Service that the United States had, they had to have a licensed pilot, and the boat had to be licensed before they could travel on the river system. So the Union Army had no recourse but to employ the steamboats and their crew to get this work done. And this was done through the Quartermaster Department, which is over in Jeffersonville, was over in Jeffersonville. So in January of this went on for most of the war. In January of 1863, there was a fleet of 32 transports. They were escorted by 4 gunboats. They gathered at the Louisville wharf and they traveled to Nashville for an attack. The boats were loaded with supplies, including military and including artillery and soldiers. So they took them all down. They all arrived like at midnight one night. They came into the city when everyone was asleep. So in employing these boats, one of them was the Ben South. That was the Portland New Albany Ferry, that was owned by Emily McCary. And she leased it to the Army and had Captain Moses Urban at the helm at that time. The boat was then burned at Cumberland City, Tennessee. And Emily McCary received $23,000 for that boat. And I would think that in Civil War times, that was a lot of money for that boat. Pinckney Garble was one of the false pilots. He had 3 boats that went to on that same trip to Nashville. He lost one steamboat named Charlie Miller and received $21,000 for it. Now my ancestor, George Miller, had his saline that was chartered for several months. He went to Nashville that same trip, but he also then was in charge of running smaller rivers in the upper Louisiana and Mississippi area, the smaller rivers there. But then when his time was up, he just couldn't help himself because he was right there at a plantation of somebody he had worked with before. They needed to get their cotton to New Orleans. So George said he would do it. So he ended up going to taking that boatload of cotton to New Orleans. When he got there, he had a big splash in the paper because they hadn't seen him for so long. He was normally there on a weekly or daily basis, and so they had a big article about him in the paper. But when he arrived in New Orleans, all of the cotton had been shot with gunshots all up and down the river. He had been shot at the whole time he was coming down, and so the cotton was worth nothing. But he tried. He knew he had to try. He was doing it for a friend. Okay, the next picture, please. That picture that we just showed, that was a hospital boat. That was another thing that they had to use him for. That was a hospital boat actually right here at the wharf in Portland. But the U.S. Army used those for hospitals along the river system. Okay, this boat is the historic Robert E. Lee. The historians thought that steamboating had died after the Civil War. Many historians have said this, but it's not the case. After the Civil War, the Howards at Jeffersonville built some of the most beautiful steamboats that they ever had on the rivers, and the biggest. Captain John W. Cannon was from Kentucky, but he spent his life in New Orleans, most of his life in New Orleans. But he came back to New Orleans, he came back to Louisville right after the war, and had a boat built in New Albany, and they named it the Robert E. Lee. The problem was they would not allow him to put the name of the boat on, because that was a Southern person. They would not allow the name to be painted onto the boat. So he had to bring the boat across to Portland to have its name planted before he could take it south. Now this was the Robert E. Lee that raced the Natchez. And the Natchez was owned by T.P. Leathers, who was another Kentucky boy. They all most of them went to New Orleans. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to go through a bunch of slides now. This is the J.M. White. I wanted to show you the impact that steamboats had on the falls area. And this one famous steamboat will give you that demonstration. It was built in 1878. She was owned by John W. Tobin of the Greenville and New Orleans Packet Company. Tobin was another Kentucky boy. He was from Tobinsport. That was very easy to remember, Tobinsport. The J.M. White has always been said that was built at the Howards. But the reality was the Howards only built the superstructure and the hull and then did the exterior painting, which was the case with most boats. This is kind of, everybody thinks the Howard built the boats completely, but they didn't. That's all they built. Then the boat had to come across the river to Louisville. Next slide, please. There were more than 30 companies involved in the building of the J.M. White. This is a picture of, not the J.M. White, but another boat. But this is a boat that would have come across from the Howards to 9th Street and Maine. And they were there to get their steam engines at 9th and Main from Ainsley and Custer. She also received her boilers at that time from Joseph Mitchell, who was located on Main Street between 12th and 13th. And William Weir did all the sheet metal work, and he was located on Main at 13th Street. So that whole area down there was actually a steamboat building area. Next slide, please. Okay, the original style and architecture of the cabin and all the interior on the J.M. White was designed by Thomas Bell. And then the work was done by Bell, Hillerick, and Coggleshell at the Louisville Wharf. So the boat remained at the Louisville Wharf for several months, and they did the work. Bell, Hillerick, and Coggleshell's office was at Washington Street near Shelby. again, right downtown in the New Albany, that downtown area. The name Hillary may be familiar to some of you, because that's the same family that advanced to maybe baseball bats today. This company, in doing cabins, they did cabins for over 163 steamboats. So they would have all come to the Louisville Wharf for the work. Next slide, please. That's the staircase. They would have designed that whole staircase area. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a picture of the interior, and all of the stained glass that was done on the boat was done by William Bloom. They were on Green Street, which is now, I think, Liberty Street in Louisville. The Gorham Manufacturing Company out of New York, did the silverware and the cutlery, and they did the big water container that's shown in this picture. All the steamboats had a water container. The rest of the china and glassware and the queensware was all done by Dollfinger Company, which was a company that was in existence. I don't know if it's still in existence, but it was until recently, I'm sure. Next slide. Okay, this is showing one of the 7 chandeliers that were in the main cabin. They had 7 of these in the main cabin. This was done out of a company out of Philadelphia, and they were made especially for the J.M. White. The carpets were supplied by W.H. McKnight, and he was on Main Street between 3rd and 4th. So go to 3rd and 4th on Main Street to get carpet now. The next photo, please. This shows another of the chandeliers, but Louisville furnished all of the a lot of the interior products also. And this shows, whether you can see them clearly or not, we've tried to count them, there were about 150 parlor chairs that they had in that main cabin, and they used them every day. This is one of those chairs. That's why we brought it. Okay. Next slide, please. The chairs were all built by the Rimpermeyer Furniture Company, and then manufactured at the Kentucky Furniture Company that's at 15th and Portland. And those 2 buildings still exist down here on 15th Street, and they're still being used. Next slide, please. Yes. All of the parlor chairs, that indicated they were a parlor chair because he would roll them in and out. Someone would stand, a lady sat in the chair, and a man pushed them in. So they were pushed. And they were also sitting along the side, and they had to bring them all into the middle when they were at the tables. So they were moved a lot. So parlor chair always had rollers in the front wheels, front legs.
Thank you, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Let's see. Okay, this doesn't show it very well, but this is when the J.M. White received its bell, and it was done by William Kay, who cast the bell and all the brass work that was on the boat. And they were on Water Street between 1st and 2nd. So another company, you can imagine that whole wharf area down there being filled with companies that were for the steamboats. The J.M. White was built to carry 10,000 bales of cotton. So as you can see, all the cotton is stacked on this boat. Each of those bales weighed 500 pounds apiece, if you can imagine that, and could carry up to 10,000. The other fascinating story of this is that the owner of that cotton, and his whole family, usually went to New Orleans with it. And the women, of course, went shopping. And the men made sure that the cotton got there. But can you imagine sitting in that parlor that I showed you, with that amount of cotton all the way around it, and you're in New Orleans in September? Probably 90 degrees. But that's how they traveled. It could not have been pleasant, even though it was beautiful. But in December of 1886, the J.M. White caught fire on the lower Mississippi. They were traveling with gunpowder. And a lot of the boats traveled with gunpowder. That's how they were destroyed. So because of that, it was destroyed in just 15 minutes. the entire boat. Everything, just about everything was lost. There were a few things saved, I think. Many lives were lost, and they were never able to determine how many, because the books that would have been on the boat that told who had registered to be on there, they did not know. And a lot of people then ended up, it was in December, it was cold, they ended up in the water, and the bodies were never found. And there were about 8 of these parlor chairs that had been taken off the night before and taken to the Tobin's house in New Orleans for a party. They were having a dinner party. So 8 of the chairs made it to the house for the party. So they were not on the boat when it exploded. That's why there are 8 left. This chair has now found its way back to Portland. There's 2 in the Smithsonian. There's 2 in a museum in Texas. There's 1 in a museum in Iowa. And there's a couple others that are floating around. I'm not sure where they are. But it does have the J in white monogram at the top, so we know we'll be able to identify it if we ever find it. And I'd like to, at this point, I'd like to invite everybody to buy a ticket on the Belle of Louisville and take that excursion route that the New Orleans did in 1811. Thank you. That's
Thank
it. Questions?
Was there ever any piracy along the banks?
Not a lot on the banks, but there were the piracy was all along the coast. Yes.
Down by
Once-
New Orleans?
Yeah. Once you got out there, and if you went to go over to Havana or go up to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, there were pirates along the way. And I think that they were called pirates, but there were a lot of really bad people along the river. Some of them were Haven Rock. Haven Rock was famous for having people there that would have tried to attack the boats if they could. Yeah. Yes.
On Robert E. Lee and the Natchez, Robert E. Lee won the race, is that correct?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. Yes.
Were most of the boats that opulent?
They were later, yes. They're, the ones that the Howards built, the ones that are called the Howard boats after the Civil War, they were almost all like that. There were a few earlier before the paper would call them opulent, but I don't know what opulent really meant in 1830. The standards, I'm sure were not quite what we think they are. But yes, in the 1870s, 1880s, almost all of them were there because they were applying to the passengers. They wanted to cater to them, and that's what they were making the money.
Because I heard that the Howard Hall over there used its own employees, and that's why it's so beautiful.
Yes. It has a lot of the steamboat decor there. But a lot of the boats, like I said, 160 of them or so, came to the local wharf and had their cabins designed and built by the Bell, Hillary, and Cobbleshell Company. So they were the ones that were actually putting the glamour into those boats, not necessarily the Howards. The Howards were doing the whole work, superstructure. And usually the owner or the pilot, the master or the owner would be there at the Howards. The whole family would come, in fact. The whole family would come and they'd stay at the golf house. The girls are the ones that ordered all the fancy stuff, and the men stayed at the Howards the whole time the boats were being built. They worked over here. Yes.
On the steamboats, sometimes they had guys, a master, and other times as a captain. Is there a difference between those
Okay.
roles? Or?
The term captain is put on anyone who's working on a steamboat that you're underneath.
Oh,
So if you're a deckhand, then, if you have somebody else come up to you and tell you what to do, then you refer to them as a captain, just like you go to a doctor. Say you're a doctor. But a master is the one that either did not have to know how to run a boat. They were the owner, they could be the owners.
Oh.
And they were in charge, but the pilot was actually the person totally in charge of running the boat while they were on duty for that hour or 2 hours or day or whatever it would be. The pilot was actually in charge. But if you worked in the engine room, you refer to that man as captain. the person that was over you on that. So that, there is a little bit of a difference there. Yes, sir.
Did you mention earlier a Garrettson shipyard?
Yes.
Is that in any relation to Mary Millicent
Yes,
Garrettson?
yes. Mary is a descendant. Her father was Andrew, and he was an engineer on steamboats. But then the other, going back a couple more generations, is her family. They came from Cape May, right after the Revolutionary War, like everybody did. They came here, they received land on Silver Creek on the Floyd County side. So all of their boats then would have been registered on, but they were shipbuilders in Cape May. So they knew, they got the word real quick about the time the Tarascons did, that you had to come to the falls. Everybody was getting that word on the East Coast. If you were coming anywhere to do steamboat work, you came to the falls. And they knew this was going to be where it was happening. They built quite a few ships, and they went to Europe. The ships would go from here, go down to New Orleans, and they would go to Europe. The ships did.
And what I've also read is the fact that Andrew was an engineer, a
He was-
steamboat engineer. So what is the difference? What role did he play?
An engineer would be in charge of the engine itself. Down in, if you go on the Belle of Louisville and you go into the right when you first get on, and there's a whole room there that has all the equipment and everything, there is one person in charge of that room, and that would be the engineer. And you have to be licensed.
Was there any I'm sorry. Was there any indication that George and Andrew were friends?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And that's how she met
That's,
him?
I'm almost, I don't have any, shall we say, proof, but yes, George and Andrew were the same age.
Yeah.
There was a big difference in the age. And then George's first wife, Elizabeth, died right after the Civil War. He made all this money on the Civil War. He came back here, bought his house, 4 acres there in Portland, built a house, and then she became ill and died within a year or so. But he had small kids at home, and like they did then, you got married. And, you know, Andrew lived on 22nd in Maine. So they were friends, they worked together, we all know that, you know, the family was all real close. That is something I grew up with, was family was always close. When George went south in the 50s, Mary went with him, Elizabeth went with him, and the kids went with him. And then after the Civil War, Mary did the same thing. But he got another boat, they built another boat, went south, and Mary went with him, with the kids. She schooled the kids. And I mean, my family never looked at her as a hero. Some people do. But for us, she was doing what she needed to do. This was what a wife did. She helped her husband. He was getting up in age, he was in his 70s. And there were times that he just couldn't run the boat, and so she was running the boat. There's quite a fascinating story about Mary, and I've put it together. I haven't really gone through all of it publicly, but she was a main figure with the women's rights that was going on at the same time. The Susan B. Anthony, when
A lot of women.
Yeah. Well, when Mary did not get her license, it first appeared in the Washington, D.C. newspaper. That's where it appeared first. And it literally went all the way around the world. And there was, the same article was usually printed, but it went all over the world. And all the different opinions from everybody on that. But Susan B. Anthony apparently scolded verbally Secretary of the Treasury very badly at a meeting that they had in Washington, D.C. And the poor man died just a few weeks after. in a hotel room all by himself.
You said some of these boats they would go down and to the Mississippi, and then they would travel over to Europe. But at the bottoms of the boat,
They were the ships that went down. And the ships were being built here. The Tarascon built
so the
ships,
ships and not the
not the steamboats.
Not the steamboats.
Yeah, the steamboats may have gone to, over to Havana. That wasn't too far.
Right.
But most of the boats that went to New Orleans and went to Europe were actual ships.
Yes.
And on the Tarascon, is that the Tarascon brothers that later
Yes.
had the mill?
Yes,
You
yes,
said that.
yes, yeah, yeah, on shipping, yes.
So people came here to do the work, because this is where the work was. Is it true that the German artisans that were into cast iron and oil work from the outside came here and, because they were blue collar, they would do that same kind of work on their houses, like shotgun houses, outside that looked really ornamental?
Yeah, they were working on steamboats, yeah, the East Coast Louisville had to have been the top of the East Coast. When you had these big shipbuilding people, the United States that I mentioned, that was another ship captain that came